I guarded Prince Andrew long before the world decided what to call him. Back then, he was not controversial. He was not avoided. He was not spoken about in lowered voices. Inside the palace, he moved differently from the others. To the public, Andrew was often described as confident, occasionally reckless, sometimes arrogant. Inside the system, those words were never used. There was another understanding instead, an unspoken one. Some members of the family were protected because of duty. Some were protected because of legacy. Andrew was protected because no one believed he could ever fall. I noticed it in small moments at first. Doors opened faster for him. Questions stopped halfway through sentences. Staff who would challenge others chose silence instead. When mistakes were made, explanations were prepared before consequences were considered. When concerns were raised, they were reframed as misunderstandings. When discomfort appeared, it was absorbed quietly by those around him. This was not favoritism in the obvious sense. It was something more dangerous. It was the belief that certain people were untouchable not because they were flawless, but because acknowledging their flaws would damage the image everyone depended on. I did not understand it fully at the time. I only understood the rule. Do not confront directly. Do not document too clearly. Do not escalate unless instructed. Most importantly, do not make this a family problem. Because once something became a family problem, it stopped being anyone's responsibility. The palace did not see Andrew as a risk. It saw him as a constant. And constants are rarely questioned. Only later did I realize that what protected him also isolated him. And what isolated him removed the final barrier between privilege and consequence. But at the time, none of us believed that day would ever come. We believed the system would always hold, and that belief shaped everything that followed. People believed Prince Andrew was reckless, a pilot with a taste for attention, the type of man who enjoyed privilege and expected the world to applaud. Inside the palace, that word reckless was rarely used. What we saw instead was something far more complicated and far more protected. The public imagined he was simply indulged, like a spoiled child. But indulgence was not the true mechanism. It was management. It was the quiet art of smoothing edges before anyone outside could feel the cut. When other royals made a mistake, the correction came quickly and visibly. A schedule adjusted, a conversation held behind a door, a reminder delivered with a polite face and a hard tone. With Andrew, the correction often arrived already wrapped in reassurance. I saw it in how people reacted before he even entered a room. A private secretary would stop mid-sentence and start again with softer words. A senior aide would glance at the corridor first, as if the air itself needed warning. Staff who were confident with everyone else became careful with him, not out of respect, but out of calculation. There was a particular kind of laughter that followed him. Not joy, not admiration. The sort of laughter people use when they want the moment to pass without friction. When he said something sharp, it was turned into a joke. When he pushed too far, it was described as a mood. When someone looked uncomfortable, the discomfort was treated as their problem, not his. The public also believed he was powerful in the family. The truth was stranger. He was protected like someone fragile, but no one ever said he was fragile. It was implied through procedure. His presence changed decisions. not because he demanded it loudly, but because people anticipated what would happen if they did not accommodate him. I remember standing near a doorway while a small debate unfolded between staff. It was not about policy or principle. It was about timing, about whether a certain detail should be mentioned now or later or never. Someone said it would be better to be direct. Another person answered quietly that directness could become a scene, and scenes became stories, and stories became problems. The public got that wrong. They thought the family ignored warning signs because they did not see them. In reality, warnings were often seen, then softened, then translated into something safer to say out loud. Even the language changed around him. People stopped using words like consequence. They used words like inconvenience. They stopped saying he had crossed a line. They said the situation had become complicated. They stopped saying no. They said not yet. You might think this was loyalty. It was not loyalty in the human sense. It was loyalty to continuity, to the illusion that nothing inside the palace was ever truly out of hand. And that is why the public never understood the most important point. Andrew was not treated as untouchable because everyone adored him. He was treated as untouchable because touching the truth felt more dangerous than letting it drift. At the time, I told myself this was how institutions survived. You protect the weak points. You cover the cracks. You keep the surface calm. Only later did I understand that a protected weakness does not disappear. It grows stronger. In private, there were habits no one discussed, not because they were shocking, but because they contradicted everything the public believed. Prince Andrew was often described as confident, effortless, at ease with attention. Behind closed doors, what I saw was something closer to expectation without preparation. He did not adjust easily. Schedules bent around him, not because he demanded it outright, but because he resisted adapting to anything that did not suit him. When plans changed, irritation surfaced quickly. Not anger, something sharper, a sense that the world had failed to follow its assigned role. There were routines he insisted upon that made little sense to outsiders. Meals taken at precise times regardless of circumstance. Rooms arranged exactly as he preferred, even in residences that were not his own. Objects moved back into place after staff had adjusted them for practicality. These were not eccentricities. They were signals. Silence followed these moments. Staff learned quickly which details were not worth mentioning. A misplaced item would be corrected quietly. A comment that landed badly would be smoothed over before it reached the wrong ears. Over time, people stopped reporting small incidents altogether. I noticed that he rarely questioned why things happened for him. Access was assumed. Deference was expected without being requested. When it was absent, the reaction was not outrage but confusion, as if a rule had been broken that everyone else should have known. There were also moments of charm. They mattered because they complicated everything. He could be engaging, humorous, even generous in short bursts. These moments were often used later as evidence that concerns were exaggerated. Someone would say he had been perfectly pleasant yesterday. Someone else would nod, relieved to agree. What troubled me most was how rarely he reflected. Others in the family questioned themselves constantly. How they appeared, how they were received, how their actions might be interpreted beyond the walls. Andrew seemed insulated from that instinct. In private conversations, staff avoided certain topics altogether. Not politics, not policy, accountability. The idea that behavior could accumulate meaning over time was uncomfortable to raise. It was easier to address each incident as separate. A misunderstanding here. A bad day there. The public believed nothing was visible until it was too late. The truth is that many things were visible, just never connected. Each moment was treated as an exception, and exceptions do not form patterns if you refuse to line them up. Silence was not encouraged. It was expected, not by him alone, by the environment built around him. That environment did not ask him to change. It asked everyone else to adapt. And that was the side never meant to be seen. The palace did not try to punish Prince Andrew. It tried to manage him. That distinction mattered more than anyone admitted at the time. When concerns became too consistent to ignore, the response was never confrontation. It was adjustment. His calendar shifted slightly. Certain appearances were reduced. Meetings were reframed as optional. Decisions were filtered before they reached him. On paper, it looked like support. In practice, it was containment. I remember the first time I realized the system had changed its posture. A senior aide spoke to me quietly after a routine engagement. There had been tension. Not public, not recorded. Just enough to unsettle a few people in the room. I expected a follow-up conversation, a correction, something formal. Instead, the aide said it would be easier next time if we kept the environment smaller. Not if we addressed the behavior, if we reduced the witnesses. From that point on, everything became about reducing friction rather than addressing cause. Staff were instructed indirectly, not with written orders, but with tone, with pauses, with the kind of phrasing that suggested cooperation was wiser than clarity. If someone pushed back, the system did not discipline them. It isolated them. Their access narrowed. Their involvement lessened. They were described as difficult, not disloyal, just inconvenient. Andrew himself remained unchanged. Why would he not? The structure moved around him like water. Each resistance met with redirection rather than force. Over time, this created a quiet divide. There were those who believed management was the safest option. They argued that direct challenge would provoke defensiveness, that escalation would invite attention, that attention would harm the institution more than any private discomfort. Others believed something else, that avoidance was becoming endorsement, that each accommodation taught him the wrong lesson, that silence was no longer neutral. These disagreements were never resolved. They were buried under procedure. Committees replaced conversations. Language softened further. Risk assessments focused on optics rather than behavior. The Crown values continuity above correction. It always has. But continuity requires belief. And belief requires that the system knows when to stop protecting itself from truth. In Andrew's case, the system chose comfort over clarity. By the time external pressure began to form, internally there was already fatigue. Not shock, not disbelief. Fatigue. The kind that comes from years of carrying something without naming it. When the conflict finally surfaced, it did not feel sudden to those inside. It felt overdue. And the most unsettling part was this. The palace had spent so long managing the situation that it had forgotten how to confront it. What was once considered unthinkable had quietly become inevitable. History will remember the moment when the protection finally failed. The interviews, the statements, the withdrawal from public duties. But inside the palace, what was lost happened much earlier. By the time consequences became visible, the family was no longer arguing about facts. They were reckoning with distance. Trust had thinned quietly. Conversations shortened. Certain names stopped being mentioned in certain rooms. What surprised many people outside was the speed with which the institution closed ranks. What surprised those inside was how little there was left to defend. For years, the system had been designed to protect an assumption that nothing truly irreversible could happen within the family. That reputation could always be managed. That loyalty would eventually outweigh discomfort. When that assumption collapsed, it did not collapse loudly. It collapsed administratively. Roles were redefined. Invitations were reconsidered. Presence became conditional. The language of support shifted into the language of separation, not exile, distance. The family did not fracture publicly. It narrowed privately. Some relationships never recovered not because of anger, but because of embarrassment. Others survived only by refusing to speak about the past at all. Silence returned, but it was no longer protective. It was evasive. What was lost was not simply standing or privilege. It was credibility inside the system itself. Staff who had once believed that discretion guaranteed safety began to question that belief. Younger aides learned a different lesson than intended. That proximity to power could blur responsibility. That management could replace accountability. That untouchable was never a permanent status, only a temporary illusion. The crown endured. It always does. But something human never returned. The sense that protection was synonymous with care. The belief that silence could still be neutral. The comfort of thinking that consequences only belonged outside the gates. Those who stood closest do not remember this story as a scandal. They remember it as a failure of judgment repeated too often and corrected too late. Not because no one saw it coming, but because too many believed the system would absorb it. And for a long time it did. Until it could not anymore.